Welcome back to Radio Juxtapoz. My name is Doug Gillen, and today Evan Pricco sits down in conversation with freight train connoisseur Tim Conlon. Tim Conlon is a painter known for his large-scale paintings, murals and sculptures. But more specifically, Tim Conlon is best known for freight train graffiti. Today on Radio Juxtapoz, Evan Pricco and Tim catch up as the doors close to his show Tracks of Time at Beyond the Streets Gallery in LA. Not too many artists can claim to have exhibited in the Smithsonian Gallery, and Tim is not only one of them, but he can also claim it as his entry into the fine art world, also making it the first work in the Smithsonian to represent modern graffiti culture. One thing I will say about this episode today is that you are about to learn as much around the history of graffiti as you are American logistical infrastructure. And that is not a sentence I ever thought I'd say on this podcast. But it does make total sense. As always, all the relevant links and socials will be in the show notes for this episode, and if you do enjoy it, make sure you let us know, and why not subscribe to the channel. This is one of the most beautifully niche conversations we've had this year, and I mean that in such a great way. So let's go down the freight train rabbit hole right now with Tim Conlon and Evan Pricco on Radio Juxtapoz.
We're like the New York Times Daily podcast, so we're up early.
Yeah. Super early.
We could do some world news. I don't think we should do that right now.
No, I'm cool with that. I'll let you handle that one on a different podcast.
Yeah, exactly. What is well, by the way, Tim Conlon, the newest guest on the Radio Juxtapoz podcast. Tim, where are you at the moment?
Evan, I am here in my little studio in Los Angeles, California, Atwater Village, as a matter of fact, in Los Angeles, California.
You've had like a little bit of a busy summer. You had a show open in Los Angeles. You've had work in Shanghai. You've had work in London. How is the year for Tim Conlon right now?
It's been, this past year especially has been quite busy. London, as you know, we saw each other there in the springtime. That was an awesome show. Shanghai finally kicked off, which was amazing. I was kind of surprised that happened, since it's been postponed for so long. And then, following up with the success of London, I was planning on doing a solo show in the spring of 2024 with Roger at the gallery. But he was like, I want to fast track you and put you with Husk McNavin and Pose and have you guys kind of do a three solo shows together at the gallery, which I was not prepared for since I'd had, all new work I'd have to make for the show. So that gave me about 2 months, I think, because he already, gave me the deadline. It was going to be September. And I think, he told me maybe around end of July or whatever. So that was it for my summer. So it was just being in the studio working nonstop.
What is prep time for you? What do you desire in terms of prep time?
I desire probably about 5 years to maybe do a solo show with maybe, 10 pieces. No. For me, it's kind of coming up. Well, it's been a while since I've actually done a show, except for like the bigger shows, like the Beyond the Street shows. I've been working on some other projects with Roger, like at the Beastie Boys show. I was doing the Showtime documentary. So some of my art stuff I kind of put on hiatus. I was doing commissions, of course, to pay the bills in the meantime. But I wasn't really focused on doing like a new body of work. So usually, I've been doing this kind of blank canvas series, which is a series of paintings that are like photorealistic. They're all done in spray paint of the sides of chunks of a freight train car. So I was coming back to that, and I had some new techniques I've learned, over the last couple of years that I wanted to implement in this new series of paintings. So, I was kind of planning, which trains I wanted to put in, what sizes, knowing how many of the G-scale train cars, which are the smaller mini cars, which people have seen at the Beyond the Street shows, kind of gathering those together and trying to come up with a theme. Of course, this, again, was a quick turnaround time for a show. Kind of a highlight of all the stuff I've been working on the last couple of years. We're
going to talk about young Tim. We're going to talk about graffiti Tim. We're going to talk about train Tim. I was thinking, and I mentioned this in my live conversation with Mr. Gastman recently. When I was in Savannah, Georgia recently, heading to the airport from my hotel, there was about a 25-minute long train going by. While I was, trying to get to the airport, I'm like, oh God, I'm going to be late to the airport. And there's this train going by. And I thought of you because every single train car had graffiti. 25 minutes of a train going by. It's quite a big train and a ton of graffiti on it. And I was wondering, one, do you observe trains in a way like that? Do you document trains just by going to certain train yards that you know will have something like that? And also, when did it kind of start happening in America where every single train car was hit?
Well, let's see. Number one, I think I want to touch on the reason why we paint freight trains is sticking you in front of a train for 25 minutes and you're going to be a hostage of our artwork pulling by you as you're racing to get to the airport.
It gave me something to look at. I liked it.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah. When I started back in 1993, there was no graffiti on freight trains. There was nothing. And to see where it is now is mind blowing. You know, back then when we were all younger and there was a bunch, you know, a few of us in different cities coming up and talking about this, I don't think any of us ever thought like every train car in North America would have some sort of graffiti on it, which it does now. And it's crazy just to see the amount of time that people are doing to get out and paint that many cars it's crazy. Back when we were painting, it was, if you did 100 cars in a year, that was like a big dent, you know, supposedly in our minds, you know, on the freight system. To see, you know, where it is now, again, it's kind of, I would never think that like, okay, every single train car is going to have graffiti. And now I'm kind of looking forward to seeing train cars that don't have graffiti because that's a paintable car, you know, versus now everything's got something on it. And it also carries a history of all this graffiti that's been there for over, you know, 30 years. Some of that stuff you don't want to paint over because it's just been out there surviving for so long. So, you know, you got to skip those cars depending upon, but there's just so many people painting them, so much graffiti on them now. It's shocking.
How aware are you where the trains are headed? Or how aware were you, not to incriminate you if you're doing trains now?
Sure. Well, I don't, let's roll back here. So I don't, as far as like following trains, tracing trains, and benching trains, I don't do it as much as I did when I was younger. That was more of a full-time gig, trying to, you know, figure out where trains were going, where they were traveling to, what they were carrying, so you knew what trains you wanted to paint on to get your graffiti to travel across the country. And that was, again, before the internet and other stuff. So it was a lot of legwork. It was a lot of just going out. There was no Google Maps to go and like, you know, oh, look at a satellite view and here's some train cars laid up behind this warehouse. You're actually walking those tracks. You're driving around. You're trying to figure out, okay, what businesses are loading stuff into this? What are these logos on these cars? Because that's kind of an identification of like, okay, this is a paper company, or this is, well, obviously, if it's like a liquor company or whatever, and they're shipping stuff, then you can kind of follow and track, okay, well, if it's a paper company, obviously, maybe there's going to be from the Pacific Northwest where there's, you know, tons of treaties and lumber and all that stuff. So we should probably hit these cars if we're, you know, in Baltimore, Maryland. It's going to obviously travel across the country, end up Pacific Northwest, travel back, yada, yada. We also figured out back in that early stage how you could track the train just as businesses do to ship their stuff in a train car. And it's an automated system. And it's, you know, you could just dial the numbers, put in, you know, the number on the train car, which is identification marks, usually on the left side of the car, which would be, you know, the company name of the car. Say it was like Canadian National, it'd be like CN, and then whatever the number was, 12876. And you put it into this automated system, and it would tell you, okay, well, it was in Los Angeles, California on Tuesday, headed towards St. Louis, and will arrive, you know, on Friday and at a certain time. So then we're kind of like, okay, figuring out exactly where, you know, some of these trains are going, beyond just doing the research, like I said, of seeing these train companies, their logos, and trying to figure out, okay, what is this kind of weird? Why is this car painted this way? What is it doing? You know, sometimes hints in the logos on the train cars of like what they're hauling and stuff like that.
And are you communicating with artists in different cities, and you're like, oh, I actually realize now that my piece is going to ride quite a long time. Like, it's not being painted over. Like, was this a way for all of you, for a certain group of people to communicate about what stays?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, we're kind of jumping in tracks of time here. So back in the early stages, you know, there was not a lot of graffiti writers. So, you know, you're kind of in your home city painting, researching, and figure out, okay, these trains, let's say in Baltimore, a lot of auto parts cars, stuff would come into the ports, ship out from Baltimore to St. Louis, and then St. Louis up to Detroit. So then he would start to network with some of these other writers in different, cities. And way back when, you would even write sometimes the name of your city on the train car. Because then people, again, the internet was in its infancy. So people didn't know necessarily, okay, this style that you would see on a freight car, like, well, this is different. Like, what is it? Like Philly hands or whatever that would be on a train car. Some people in the Midwest might not know, okay, well, that's a Philadelphia hand versus a Baltimore hand or whatever. So, yeah, so there's like the early networking of people going to the train yards, doing, using the touch trace number to figure out where your cars are traveling to. Once you start to network with people, then you can say, hey, we painted this car last night in Baltimore. It's on its way to you in St. Louis. It'll be there on Wednesday. If you can get daytime flicks of our piece, because a lot of times you go into a yard, take photos, or you have a benching spot where the trains are coming by. And then they might paint the other side of that car knowing that it's going to head back to Baltimore. Because freight cars are kind of like airlines. Like it's the same kind of flights every day, certain times and stuff like that. So that way, then they painted the other side. It comes back to you in Baltimore. You take the daytime photos of their graffiti on the train. And then you're getting it developed. So there's, again, no digital cameras back then. So you have to do this whole manual process of, all right, you have 24 or 36 images on a camera. You're taking photos of a moving train or, in a dark yard or whatever. So you're limited on the amount of shots you even have on your camera. And you're taking these photos and you have to go get them developed. They come back to you. You look at them. About half of them are just flash burned or just too dark, and you just got to trash them. Hopefully, you've got a good photo of your friend's graffiti that you talked to in St. Louis, and then you start building a pack of photos. And it takes a while because there's not a ton of graffiti on the trains. So meanwhile, you're trying to catch the graffiti from your friends in St. Louis or whatever, but the stuff's passing you by from Florida or from New York. So you're taking photos of that. You might add those into the pack. And then eventually you mail that pack of photos and a note to, your friends in St. Louis. So it's a whole long manual process of, documenting, taking photos, doing the legwork of like going around to the different train yards or your layup spots, waiting for the photos to be developed. And then, and then that was the whole like pen pal kind of process in the beginning.
What is actually quite interesting about what you're talking about, and it's what connects a lot of like American sort of literary history, is like what you're talking about, like the idea of the train as this kind of bohemian cult appreciated infrastructure, of America. It's been written about, it's been documented. Were you learning a little bit about America that you didn't quite maybe know before by just this kind of understanding of the like kind of geographical landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I was really fascinated with the train car logos. I mean, I would take photos of them even if I knew what the company was already, or if we already knew where the trains were headed. I just like these old logos. A lot of them you could tell were just there for over 40 years or whatever. And a lot of these companies were long gone. It was there was hundreds of short lines, and then as we are now, there's like I think maybe 5 or 6, maybe 7 like large railroads that just, would keep gobbling up the smaller railroad companies, would paint over their, box cars, and you would lose all this kind of, the hobo markings, these old company logos that were really elaborate and very cool looking, just the fonts and the company names and stuff like that. So yeah, there was a kind of an instant like love of like appreciating, all right, there's rail cars, there's hobos, there's workers. There's a lot of history to this infrastructure. It's kind of built America, essentially. And so even when I was taking photos of some of that stuff and we're busy putting our own graffiti on the cars, I was documenting a lot of what we call monikers, which are either the worker tags or hobo tags done with chalk or oil bar markers on the trains.
And how aware were you of these monikers before you started going to the trains yourself? Were you aware that there was this network of tags, or was this something it was all self-discovery at this point? It's
self-discovery. I had no idea what these were. Sometimes, it would be, I would see it's a repetitive image I would see on boxcars, and I would say like, okay, what is this like face with a cowboy hat? And it's got a little saying next to it. And I would just document it because I'm like just curious, and I was kind of building, this kind of almost like baseball cards. Like here's that same, drawing on like a blue car or yellow car or whatever. I'm going to jump again. But, in the early days of freight train graffiti, I think it made a lot of graffiti writers better photographers, or photographers in general, because you're, going out and you have to learn how to take shots. You're taking, images of moving art on trains. You have to learn how to capture, So I think it made a lot of people okay, I'm going to take a photo of my piece, but I want part of the train car. There was a lot of different freight train graffiti writers that were really, photographers. Those are people you wanted to trade with, actually, because they're taking beautiful photos of not just the train and the graffiti, but sometimes it's stuff in the background. And so you definitely want to trade your photos with those guys, because they were taking just beautiful photography of, not just the freight train graffiti, but just doing, beautiful imagery. So yeah, when I was taking photos of the monikers, I actually ended up building probably one of the first websites kind of dedicated to it. And I called it Rail Kings, I think. I was trying to make a play on Real Kings, as Graffiti Kings or whatever, because I knew these guys were out there painting. They were doing this stuff before we were putting our hip hop graffiti on top of, the trains, and people were painting right over, these monikers.
Give us just for the casual listener, can you give us an era of when these monikers started to appear on trains? Are we talking about 30s, 40s, and 50s, or what are we talking about?
The ones from the 30s and 40s, probably weren't many out when I started painting in 93. There was a life on a boxcar, usually around, I think, 40 years at the time, was as long as a boxcar could be on the rails. And then I think they could be rebuilt, so they could be repaired, sold to another company, and then maybe 10 more years added onto that life. Then they're scrapped. So a lot of that early, hobo graffiti or worker graffiti, monikers, I should say, a lot of that would be lost to trains being scrapped.
Right. So the Jack Kerouac era of hopping trains and boho culture, that is past by the time you're doing this.
It is, but there is spots where people are catching out, like the ride trains.
Yeah. Okay.
Those spots, there's even spots here in Los Angeles where there's stuff that's, hidden. I mean, if you look it up, I don't want to divulge too much, but some of these old hobo tags from the 20s are still, underneath these trestle bridges and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily on the trains, but it's definitely in the hobo jungles and, different spots like that. It's definitely still out there, some of it, just because it's protected in tunnels or whatever. So it's not, weathering and stuff like that isn't also, taking them away. So
then I have to ask, so there's I'm always aware of this. Graffiti has a secret language, but what about the people who are seeking out these things? They don't give out, there's not a lot of divulging of the secrets of where these things are. There's a language that is not prevalent to just the layman.
Yeah. I mean, I would say with the advent of the internet, it's all kind of all divulged. If you want to find it, you can find it. All the clues are out there. I think people try to keep everything still close to their chest, especially stuff these older hobo tags and stuff like that, all it takes is somebody just to do paint over, throw up over, not knowing, the history of some of this stuff. So I think people that really appreciate it definitely try to keep it, some of these, rare gems, as secretive as you can.
Let's go back to young Tim here, because we've jumped kind of all where we're staying in the trains. But where did you grow up, and what were you afforded in terms of early art opportunities?
Grew up south of Washington, D.C., so I have a big Irish family that's been in the D.C. area since we immigrated in late 1800s, I believe. Yeah, my family decided to move us to southern Maryland. It was just farms. There's a lot of Amish communities there, still horse and buggies and stuff like that, even though it's just 40 minutes south of the nation's capital. But we would travel every weekend to go see both my sets of my grandparents still lived in D.C. So I was back and forth between these rural cultural farms and then back in the city, constantly. And I was always interested in the urban side of things versus where I was, in the farmland, tobacco fields kind of area where I was raised. And I was always interested in art as a kid. So my parents definitely kind of pushed me in that direction of, trying to put me in art classes or, buying me art supplies so that, I'm sitting around watching cartoons on a Saturday morning and I'm, drawing what I'm seeing on TV. It wasn't until probably when I was going to college or when I was, applying for college, I was like, I want to go to a city. I need to be near a city. And I ended up going to college in Baltimore. And that's where I ended up shortly thereafter getting involved with graffiti. That was, another quick jump. But, and that kind of involved me being like into skateboarding and kind of like being in these urban areas and just, wanting to, well, first of all, skate at some of these abandoned spots, whatever. But then I would see these giant graffiti pieces or tags. And because I was interested in art, I'm like, well, what is this stuff? Like, this is not making any sense. I can't read it, but it looks very cool. And it's, Baltimore's got a very old history as far as probably in the hierarchy of like where it started. There's Philadelphia and New York. And I would say Baltimore shortly thereafter from revolt coming down to Baltimore and kind of getting the art scene started, which then a Baltimore writer went to San Francisco and started the graffiti scene out there.
I was hoping that you were going to tell me as a child like you had like toy train sets and that you were like obsessed with the trains. No?
I did have we did have a train set, but it only really came out at Christmas time and we got put around the base of the Christmas train.
Yeah.
I do I've thought about times of like when did graffiti really kind of enter my head? And I remember like watching Welcome Back, Carter and the beginning intro. I don't know if you remember the show, and you see the subways going by and there's like graffiti on it. I do vividly remember that. Like, what is that? What's on these trains? And then even doing the some of the work for this show was Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Conjunction Junction was freight trains in a train yard being put together, and it had conjunctions and, or, and then different words that they were putting in. There was a whole song about it. So, I mean, freight train graffiti was very early on, being broadcast to kids all across the country, if you think about it.
But so you're in Baltimore. You are starting to immerse yourself in some subcultures, graffiti, skateboarding. What was the first time someone's like, let's go to the train yard and paint?
The first moment was I thought this is the dumbest idea in the world to paint on freight trains. It didn't make any sense.
Wait, why?
I was just starting to, because again, there was no freight train graffiti scene back then.
Okay.
Again, with the internet or the lack of the internet, people were really painting locally in their cities and like really developing and following their city's graffiti style. So, Baltimore has a very distinct style, DC, like every, kind of East Coast city and, other cities as well across the country.
And you were, at the time, you're aware of the fact that like there's subway art. New York had the transit systems were getting hit with graffiti, but maybe not the freight scene was being hit with graffiti.
Exactly. But we had a friend, one of my skateboarding friends who was a local graffiti writer, put us into the scene and like kind of explained like, all right, this is a graffiti piece. These are tags. These are throw ups. And he had been painting for years, since the like early 80s in Baltimore. And one of his friends that he was in a crew with, his name was Jace, was living out in San Francisco. And he was already starting to paint freight trains. And then, since we're all friends and we call and talk and we'll just trade photos, he was like, you guys are new. I know you guys are getting your name out in Baltimore, but you need to focus on freight trains. And we were like, well, why? Why do we want to paint on freight trains? Like, nobody's going to see this stuff. We paint them and they're going to leave the city. We're trying to get our name out there in Baltimore so people know who we are. And it was very short-sighted at the time. But we were like, all right, fine, we'll paint freight trains. We'd go early in the evening, paint a bunch of freight trains, and then go out and street bomb and hit the city like we really wanted to until like, the sun came up. And I would say it took maybe about a month before the light bulb moment when we went into the same spot we were painting. And there was this giant crash piece from Oakland that was like probably, I think, like half to 3/4 of the train car. And I just remember looking at my two other, street bombing partners and we're like, oh, shit, like this is why we need to focus on train. This is from Oakland. And like, we've never seen Oakland graffiti or whatever. And look how big it is. And like, and it just made it all the way across the country. We're busy trying to be all city and like, just get one half, west side of Baltimore to the east side of Baltimore. Like, no, we need to do the whole country. Like, this is the way to do it. This is what we need to focus on.
And then also, like, you're in the train yards, and because it's fresh and new, like, you weren't being harassed by police or any sort of transit authority, were you?
No.
Okay.
No, but it was there. I mean, Baltimore, of course, is a very rough city. I'm sure everybody's seen The Wire. And a lot of these freight yards, though, are in very industrial and rough neighborhoods. So you're dealing more so with people in the neighborhood that are like, what are you doing here? Versus cops that are, well, they're actually police too. I mean, this is, again, graffiti was less accepted than I think it is now. They were not interested, and it also was kind of like low-hanging fruit for a lot of police officers in Baltimore. Like, all right, we can catch some of these guys and whatever. Police weren't really focused on graffiti. It wasn't like or even train railroad police, I should say. They were more so concerned with people breaking into the train cars and stealing everything out of them.
So here you go. You're starting, like, you had that light bulb moment. You see the piece from Oakland in town. Freight train graffiti becomes something. You're like, okay, I get this. And just as a technical graffiti artist, what were you learning about painting on freight trains? That was different than city. That was different than the city.
I think the first couple times painting, I mean, you have to, when you're usually out painting in the city or whatever, you're kind of painting on a flat surface. You're not usually trying to wrap your graffiti around, objects or whatever. So I think that was the first thing you learn is like, okay, well, these trains have all kinds of bars and ribs and rivets and handles and ladders. If you're lucky, you would go out and find a flat car, which means there's no like supporting ribs on the side of a freight train car. So, but you need to learn how to start painting around like more in a three-dimensional way. You have these pieces that come out, but to be able to read it straight on, you're going to need to wrap, your graffiti lines are going to have to kind of wrap around all this like stuff. So that was a extra dimension, pun intended, that you had to like focus on as we were starting off, like, trying to do these bigger graffiti pieces. And the other thing is like, you start to do these really elaborate pieces. And then once you go out and start benching them, you realize, oh, this thing's traveling at 60 miles an hour past people. They can't read or like understand what this says. It's just this giant, I mean, it might look super cool, but they're not going to, read it or understand it. So then you kind of had to build, I guess, your vocabulary or library of like, all right, you need to do like larger readable pieces, and you can do like these real detailed, cool ones, that might be thematic with like characters and all that for, other graffiti writers when the train ends up in their yard and they can take photos of it, and have that in their collection.
There's a lot of trial and error.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think, as an artist now makes me accept a lot more failure in stuff that I try, because, there was so much failure in the beginning of painting on trains and like, even like painting, with different temperatures, like you're painting on a cold metal surface versus like if you're painting on a wall or something like that, like just the paint, would just run right down the side of the train, like knowing, like, again, like I said, photography, like, oh, I just painted this piece and take a photo and then the, flash hits that bright, freshly cut paint, just bounces back at you. And then you just, waste, so you got to learn all these like techniques. And then, of course, there's just the general danger of being in a train yard, understanding you can't just like walk in and be like, oh, cool, I'm just going to paint this train, especially if you're painting in a yard. I mean, there was, different aspects to painting, different ways of approaching trains. But if you had a layup or something like that where there was no engine attached, that's a different story than going into a live train yard where there's workers, there's trains moving around, trains being humped, which means like that's where they, take a box car and they disconnect it and are going to push it down a line. So it then humps into another train car, connects, but they're just rolling silently past you. So, I mean, there's another level of like learning the safety and what you can and can't do, hopping over train cars, going underneath, like all these no-nos that like you have to kind of put together and like, okay.
I got to ask you then, what's the scariest, most sketchy time you've been in a train yard?
Man, that's probably a 2-hour podcast.
Just give us one. Give us like a one, like where it was like, oh my God. And more about like your personal safety as opposed to running from police.
Okay, I'll hear. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Let's do a personal safety PSA right now.
Yeah. Personal safety PSA. Actually, this would go out to one of Baltimore's. He's no longer with us. Rest in peace, Scotty Mask. Very old school. He definitely had more than 9 lives. He was a wild character in Baltimore. Very prolific. Kind of really set the standard for graffiti styles, piece styles in Baltimore. This was back in probably the early 2000s. There was a bunch of us all painting underneath. One of our kind of not legal spots. One of our wall spots in the city that tons of graffiti writers would go paint at. But I had some train tracks that went by. We were done painting. There was a bunch of people painting that day. 4 of us were leaving, but there was 2 trains kind of traveling in different directions, going probably maybe 5 miles an hour. It was like, all right, well, let's just wait till the trains finally, go by. But then kind of one stopped and backed up. And it was like you being stuck, in Savannah, like just waiting for this train to finally go. And Scott was just like, no, man, I'm doing it. We're going to just hop the 2 trains, but they're moving in, different directions. Even just hopping one moving train is crazy. Hopping 2 of them is just nuts. One of them was an intermodal train, which are the ones that carry, the shipping containers that are usually stacked. You see them all around Los Angeles. Well, now they're pretty much everywhere. And the bottom of those are most of them are hollow or open down to the tracks, but then the ends have platforms. Most of them don't even have like rails really if you're climbing up and across and down. And so he and I climbed up one of the trains, moving trains, and I was like, this is not a good idea. Let's go, Scott. And next thing I know, he already was in midair, jumped over to the other one, turned and fell backwards through the hole as the train was moving over top of him. And the last thing I'd seen was like him fall backwards with both his arms and legs out, knowing that that's going to be on the tracks by the time he hits the ground. And the next set of wheels is right there. And so all I saw was his baseball hat, kind of roll out onto the gravel. And I'm still moving away the opposite direction of where he had just fallen. That was like a heart-stopping moment. I was like, he's going to be in pieces from just falling on those tracks on his back. He'd had plenty of beers in him, so he was not going to be able to save himself. And my other 2 friends who had already crossed the trains when they had kind of stopped at one point in time came running back. And I was like I got to get over there and see, help him or whatever, and jumped across. And by the time I had gotten over, he had already rolled out from underneath the train. And he was just dusting his shoulder off and like, oh, where'd my hat go? And I was like, dude, you almost died. Like you would have been in like chunks. And he just, again, he had 9 lives. Like he had fallen down, and I guess as soon as he hit the ground, his kind of knocked the wind out of him, and I think it made him pull his arms and legs in. So then the wheels went over where, they were like on the track just like a second before. And yeah, I was like, this is it. I'm never getting on another, moving train or letting anybody, do that kind of thing. Just trying to hop, especially 2, it's just crazy. But this guy was just, he was lucky, but that was terrifying.
Yep. You are listening to Tim Conlon and Evan Pricco in conversation right here on Radio Juxtapoz.
Do you ever find that you have learned just an incredible amount of information about the way that things get shipped around the country that you never thought you would ever know? Just the things that you were listing off. I know we just talked about somebody almost dying on the train tracks, but the way you were describing the different storage and shipping methods that, that keeps American economy alive, is that just something that just kind of amazes you that you were actually quite aware of how this stuff moves around?
Not at all. In fact, it's some of our train yards that we would paint in, like I said, that the trains would get broken into all the time. So you would just see these random piles of stuff. Like there was one time there was just huge boxes of stovetop stuffing. They looked like, I don't know, it would have looked like 4 cinder block sized boxes of stovetop stuffing. Just random, so much random stuff. I guess people would just pop up in a train and think like, oh, maybe I'm getting a TV set out of here. And instead they were getting like water hose handles or just most random stuff, and then they just dump it. They're like, all right, they gave up and moved on. Yeah, everything gets shipped by freight, or at least, it seemed like at the time everything was being definitely shipped by freight. And I think it is now. I think less so, it's not being shipped in boxcars the way it used to be. I think everything is now switching to an intermodal system because of the world economy now and stuff being made, China and India and wherever else. It's easier to put it in a shipping container, put it on a ship, pull that off of a ship, put it on an intermodal train instead of unloading, the ship and then taking it and putting it in a boxcar. It's already in that shipping container from the factory it was made in until it's like then taken off of a train, put on the back of a semi truck, and then ends up at its warehouse or, delivery area where it's going to end up leaving. Then it finally gets unpacked there. So I think that's kind of probably helped in the decline of like the normal box car that, we were going after and painting all the time. Now it's all kind of in this intermodal system, which makes sense. It's faster, it's going to get stuff there you order on Amazon, it needs to be there, in a couple days. It's not going to go, get unpacked on a boxcar, repacked, and blah, blah, blah. So,
I really want to talk about the paintings, and I want to talk about the train models that you do. But I guess it has to just be said, why do you think that there's so many train cars covered now? I mean, I know we kind of talked about the fact that they are covered, but why do you think there's been such an explosion? Is it just something because it's still a little bit there's like a realness to it, or there's kind of like a sort of authenticity to it that it just seems to be attractive to graffiti writers even today?
I think there's a couple of things. There's the access to it. I mean, there's trains all over the place, in North America. You could be somebody in the Midwest that's not in a big graffiti mecca, on the West Coast or the East Coast, and you can actually do some graffiti on a train car, and then you're kind of in the game, and like your graffiti will end up in New York or Los Angeles or Seattle or Miami or whatever. So I think that was probably a major draw, this kind of our ideas on the East and West, on both coasts or whatever, painting trains, as it's going across country. These smaller cities are starting to see it, and it's probably starting, its own graffiti scene there. Back again, this is in the 90s. The access part of it is like, anybody anywhere in the country can now do some graffiti, have your name out there, and have other people take photos of it. Again, with the advent of the internet, everybody's taking photos. There's benchers. Instead of doing this whole thing of taking photos, putting them in packages, you can upload photos that you just did that night. Your camera on your phone is much better. You can take 1 million photos. It's not like, I have no good photos of that piece I just took. You can sit there and just snap away until you have a good photo. So the process has been minimized as far as like the work it takes. So I think it's easier for people to do it just technically. And so, yeah. And again, it's also the train cars and rail companies haven't really put a huge amount of effort into buffing their freight cars like transit, in city subways and stuff like that. Plus, that's such a smaller system. Like, North American train tracks is trying to like take a car out of service just to paint over it and then put it back in. And then all of a sudden it's in another part of the country and being painted. And then, it's not necessarily going to come right back. Like, a metro, is running in the city all day, same line. This thing could be out there for years until it gets back. And then who knows, all of a sudden that company could have been sold. And the way I've always looked at it in my head is like, for freight trains, for the companies, they're getting a free coat of paint. Their trains are getting rusted and weathered all along the bottom. They're going through snow, dirt, whatever. And it's just, it's not the same color scheme, but it's just being repainted. To the point now, I think I've seen different train companies where they've now taken some of the reporting marks and stuff that workers need to take their trains, when they're in a train yard, and split them up to send them, different directions. They're taking that information, putting it way up high in the top corner of a train car, because they know like this area's bottom part is going to be where the graffiti goes. And that's what they really hate, is like they're losing that information, like the load and weight limits of the train car, safety numbers, like when it was built, when it needs to be, rebuilt. So that's why a lot of, graffiti writers try to stay away from that, not paint over it, because then train companies have to come back and put a big block right over top of your graffiti, put all that information back on. So yeah, I think, it's just hard for the freight train companies to keep up with it. When we did the movie, the documentary, we tried to reach out to most of the major freight train companies and like, here's your chance to like talk about freight train graffiti, how it's affecting your business. What's your outlook on it? Why is it so prevalent right now across the country? None of them wanted to talk about it. I think one, because they don't necessarily care. They all would reference us to this group called Operation Lifesaver, which is like a nonprofit funded by all the train companies, which is about safety on the rail lines.
Oh, okay.
So that's, that was their comment on it. Essentially, it was like, talk to Operation Safety. Of course, their thing is they don't want anybody on any railroad property. They don't talk about graffiti. They just don't want anybody trespassing, anybody near it, and that's the end of the story.
Right. Let's talk about your fine art practice, because I loved what you said about the fact that freight train graffiti kind of helped you become a better photographer. And I think there's part of like what you do combines elements of graffiti, documentation, and also just the infrastructure of actually what a rail car is. You do two things. You paint photorealistic paintings that are almost like crops of the trains, and also you create, you paint and create these scale model trains. When did this kind of body of work begin for you, and how are you maintaining a freshness in your approach to painting these paintings? This obviously comes from a deep love too.
Yes, definitely comes from a deep love. It comes from, I think I've talked to you about this before. Like, I wasn't really focused on an art career or doing art, like a body of work, until I ended up being asked to do this show at this Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. Was my first jump into like the art world. Which is
like let's not even like, let's talk. That is like you played Little League and all of a sudden you're playing in the World Series.
Yes. It was the strangest thing. There's so I guess kind of just, it's hard to like kind of like go from like, oh yeah, I'm just painting, out in the freight yard, and all of a sudden I'm doing, these giant 4-5 by 20 foot paintings in the Smithsonian Portrait Gallery with Candy Wiley and some other people. I had a mutual friend named Mark Jenkins, who you guys have had in a magazine before. He knew a curator at the Portrait Gallery. This was still when I was living in DC, and they knew of my work. They wanted to have a graffiti element in this hip hop show that they were doing. This was when the museum had been closed. It was in 2008, I believe. And they had renovated the museum. They wanted to bring in a younger group of people to be interested in the Portrait Gallery, the museum itself, because there's a lot of old portrait art. And there's the American Art Museum. It's kind of split museum. So they were focused on doing this hip hop exhibit. I think originally, before the museum reopened, you had to be deceased for like 10 or 15 years before your art could be shown in the Portrait Gallery, which was also a weird, thing that they got rid of. So like, all right, we're going to get rid of that rule and let's bring in some hip hop. I met with the curators, which was very bizarre. I think they were prepared for me to come in with a hoodie on and paint on my hands. And I sat with the curators. I'm not going to name the one curator who I really like, but he had a bow tie on, and he was just, he must have gone online and figured out all the, graffiti slang that he could to start immediately talking to me like, yeah, we need you to do this real dope burner tag piece thing. And I was like, okay, let's discuss, like, you guys are curators. What's the focus of the show? And so it was a very oddball situation. That was my first show.
What did you present there again?
It was 4 large 5 by 25 foot paintings. They had just redone the museum. Originally, they wanted me to paint on the walls. And I was like, well, we just did all this like $1 million construction work. Like, they were going to build this like crazy like tunnel of ventilation system for me to paint. Eventually, we're just like, why don't I just paint on some Sintra panels? You can install them on the walls and blah, blah, blah. And then I brought on my graffiti partner, his graffiti name's a wreck. And I was like, let's, do these together. I'm always like trying to bring on other friends when I have projects, when I'm, especially at this scale. It was the name of the show, which was called Recognize, was one of them. One of them was just my graffiti with these kind of king characters. It was his graffiti on one. And then I think we did one where we did a faux subway background with the graffiti, our names kind of on the train, like it would be, like in New York or whatever. So after that show, I was approached immediately by gallerists, like, oh, we want to like have you present work. Like, what's your work? And I'm like, it's out there on the train line. You could, sit out there and wait for it to come by.
You had no canvas practice at this point. You had no studio practice to okay. And then you're in the Smithsonian.
Yes. Yeah. So that's
I just want to clarify for everybody that you went from 0 to 60.
I think I'd done maybe 1 or 2 like little graffiti shows, like painting my name on a canvas, but not, any type of like, nothing that was museum worthy. That's for sure. So then galleries approached me like, yeah, this is your chance. Like, what do you have? What do you want to show? That just never really clicked. Like, oh, maybe I should, I was interested in art, of course, beyond just doing graffiti. But I didn't like necessarily doing just straight graffiti pieces on a canvas, kind of just squared off, similar to what we did for the Smithsonian, actually. I kind of was like brainstorming. I'm like, okay, well, what do I like? I like freight trains. I don't paint with brushes. I don't do oils. I don't really know acrylics that well. So I need to do something which is all spray cans, because that's what I've now been using for 20 some odd years at the time. I was like, well, let's see if I can kind of make a photorealistic freight train and then add a chunk of graffiti and add some of these logos that I love and make it more of a abstract piece instead of just all about the graffiti name, all the letters all together, framed nicely, blah, blah, blah. And so that's where I started to experiment. Like, okay, well, how am I going to make this photorealistic weathered train just with spray paint? So I came up with a different approach, which was almost like stippling. So instead of taking the can and spraying directly as close as you can to make clean lines, I used different caps and would spray like far back. So it just make this like cloud of just little speckles of paint. So I could build, it was time consuming, just building up these layers of like different, I couldn't just do a straight brown or straight, like I had to have like other colors that would bring out some of the shades and stuff. So, there's like purples in there, whatever. And just figuring out this whole technique of, in order to build up this kind of, photorealistic look. There was tons of masking I would have to do, and definitely different than my regular just graffiti practice of just like, I can just bang out these clean lines with my caps. And
were you basing these paintings on the photos that you had taken?
Yes, I was using like a lot of the old photographs of some of the old logos. Yeah, even the graffiti pieces. I mean, it was all, in the beginning, it was mostly just my stuff. But then eventually I was like, I want to throw in like some of my friends. Like, this is great that I'm like, doing these pieces. They were selling and it was great. But I was like, I want to do some homage to some friends, some that are deceased. But then I also was like, all right, if I'm learning like these new techniques, I want to kind of learn their techniques. Like friends of mine that I know, just paint differently. They bend letters differently than I would. And so then trying to like do that on the canvases was it was more interesting to me because it was eye-opening, like trying to figure out their techniques of how they're making different like clouds or highlights or why the letters bend a certain way. So it was kind of enlightening to kind of do it, with little parts of their, graffiti kind of sprinkled in on some of these canvases.
Yeah, and you were talking about the new show at Control/Beyond the Streets, that you were working on some new techniques. What were some of the techniques that you were hoping to explore and been wanting to explore with the paintings?
Yeah, so when I was, originally painting the canvases, again, it was all, spray paint. And I've been starting to make it a little bit more dimensional by using acrylic gels to kind of give a more layered effect. It's already a layered effect of, say, like, the train, and I'm doing shadows to make the ribs come out or the rivets. And then adding a layer of the logos of the train, and then the graffiti goes over top of that. And then there might be some weathering over top of that. So then I kind of wanted to reverse it a little bit and start off with like this painting behind me where it's like I rust the entire canvas and weather it. So that's a first layer. And then I might put acrylic gel around the sides to make it look more like a torched off piece of metal versus just, a squirt, the ends of the canvas running off, which has been beneficial because people think, especially when it's like in this original stage, like these are giant chunks of metal, that it's not, just spray paint on a regular gesso canvas with this little acrylic gel on the sides. From there, I would then, I already had the design in mind. I would usually on Photoshop or in Illustrator kind of design what I want everything to look like and lay out. So then I would go and kind of figure out on the rusted side of the painting, all right, I need to cover these areas because eventually this is what's going to show through. This is going to be the rust that actually breaks through like on a real train. And then, using some gels and some other techniques, then covering the original rusted painting and then plus rusted level of the painting. And then, then I paint a brand new train over top of it, top to bottom. Even though I know there's going to be graffiti over it, I still want just that whole, visually to me, it helps me kind of look at the whole thing, know where the shadows are going to be, and then weather all of that. And then, maybe I'm adding some spots where there were tags and I have to fade those out. So I'm actually like aging and like, giving this like a whole timeline to this whole, painting essentially, kind of almost like it would be on the rails, but sped up quite a bit. And then, eventually hit the graffiti part, or maybe before I hit the graffiti part, that's when I go back and peel off and reveal that rusty layer from the very, very beginning. So I have to cut open this area and just like peel away like all that different painting, break it apart and make it look like, it's kind of opening up to the way rust would on a regular freight car.
What's cool is that like you're basically reconstructing movable architecture in your studio. But then you have this other part of your body of work that's these model trains that you're painting on. Where are you getting these trains?
So the trains, just to back that up a little bit, the trains came from Art in the Streets, was the kind of the beginning of the G scale trains. They're called garden scale trains, and they're about 24 inches long. So for people that don't know, trains are so like usually you think of little model trains as are like the HOs, and the next one up is an O scale, which is about 12 inches. And then these G scales, garden scales, because usually people would run them in a garden or in their backyard because they're such long, big trains when you connect them all together.
That's actually why they're called that. I didn't even realize that. Amazing.
Yeah, G scales, garden scale. Okay. Yeah.
By the way, who does this? Like, who are the people that collect? Like, is this like an underground collector base who buys these trains? Like, not your trains. I'm just saying the actual models themselves. Like, where is this culture these days?
There's conventions still that happen all over the country. And actually, they're kind of big in Europe and in Germany as well. A lot of the trains are more of the old steam engine style. So, and like passenger cars, not necessarily modern box cars and modern,
right.
You know, they kind of like the more romantic looking, you know, engines with, you know, big smokestacks and all that kind of thing.
So is this a little bit like going to a baseball card convention? Like there's just that culture that is...
Absolutely.
Okay. Amazing.
We can get into like the live steam trains that you've seen that I've done, like the ones that's like, you know, about 8 feet long. That's a whole culture too, where people take those trains, they ride the trains, but people build tracks like all across the country, and they'll travel with them, like almost like, you know, how people travel with like motorcycles in a trailer to go ride around the country. They take their train cars, put them in these giant trailers, take it out to somebody's, you know, setup where they have like a couple acres, and they just sit on the trains and ride them, where they built like bridges and tunnels, but you sit and ride it like, you know, kid, like on a car, like in front of a grocery store, like. These are all, you know.
So are you competing with people to get these trains from these? Like, are you basically having to sort of be in some sort of subculture to get the trains before other people? Are you like seeking out certain trains that you like are hard to get? Like, I want to know just a little bit of like this. How do you collect the trains themselves? It's amazing.
So Art in the Streets, Roger asked me to curate the freight train graffiti riders from that early era of 93 that people were starting to hit freight trains. I got a bunch of these. I looked online, like tried to figure out like, okay, I can get these G-scale trains. There's a company called Aristocraft. And this was again back in 2011. They were still around at the time. And they had a bunch of different like logos, you know, of different train companies already kind of imprinted on them. And so then I, you know, started to put together a list with Roger, like, all right, here's all these different people from different cities across the country. Here's the guys that were in Miami. Here's the guys that were in New York that were painting trains at that time. Here's the guys in LA that we should get, you know, to see if they'll paint a model train. Actually, they do their graffiti on these model trains. Then we decided, all right, well, we should probably weather the trains to make them look like, you know, they were actually out on the train line. So just like a regular clean model train, you know, it would look more interesting, you know, visually, especially in the museum. And at the time, we were going to actually try to have those trains running on track, which took up, I don't think Jeffrey was happy about that because I think with the radius, it needed to be 10 feet by 25 feet long in order to have, I think, 12 trains make the radius to be able to spin around or whatever. So it took up a good chunk of real estate in the museum. So they ended up just going on the wall for that show. But thankfully, you know, let's see, it's been almost 13 years now in Shanghai.
You actually have the track. That's
fine. Just took a little bit of time, but right. Yeah. So anyway, so yeah, I got the train, bought the trains, and then went online and like looked for guys, these model train guys that go to these conventions, whatever, that weather the trains because they want to have, once they have their bulk and build their setups, they want it to look as realistic as possible. So they weather the trains. They'll go out and take photos of trains and graffiti and then add it to their own little model cars. A lot of these guys don't know anything about graffiti. They're just doing it, like hand painting it themselves. And it shows. I mean, a lot of these guys can't really, you know, some of these guys are amazing. Like they can make the piece look exactly like the graffiti of the photo they took, you know, that was out on the lines.
They're just train spotters who have this love for the
for trains, and they want their trains to look exactly like it was pulled off the rail and just shrunk down to, you know, a little tiny HO scale. And they'll have their setups with like buildings and whatever. And some of the photos that they'll take of their trains on their setups look like a realistic. I could show you some photos and you'd be like, oh, that's a train yard over in, you know, Southern California somewhere. And it's like, no, this is guy's backyard in Minnesota. He just took this in his driveway and he's, you know, made some effects to make it look like, you know, this real looking train on the track.
So where is the best train convention in North America?
I haven't been to any in a long time.
Okay.
Only because the Aristocrat company went out of business shortly after the Art in the Street show. So I was busy anytime I was traveling, going to model train shops, buying up as many of these certain cars as possible, going online and trying to find them. So I had a good amount of, I mean, you can see them here behind there's all those boxes sitting there. But yeah, just because they're gone. I mean, and then, you know, of course there's, competition with these guys that are trying to build their model railroad sets. So they want them for, you know, they don't want to see this graffiti all over the cars necessarily, unless it's like, you know, something that's going to fit their, you know, model railroad set.
Well, this is what I'm getting at is like, do you have to compete for the last of the aristocratic trains? No. Okay.
Yeah, aristocratic. That's no. Actually, there's another G-scale train company that bought the molds recently, and now have started to recreate some of the ones that I used. So now they're back out there. So it's not as, but some of the older ones, they've only made a certain amount of company cars, whereas the original Aristocrat ones, there was a whole plethora of different styles that they made.
Let's just say, because we've been talking for quite a long time, so we're kind of, what's the dream project for you right now? You've done the documentary, you've built a incredible train set that was just showing it Beyond the Streets in Shanghai, and you're kind of doing all these incredible things. But do you have like right now a kind of a dream project that you'd like to do with all the kind of the knowledge and the documentation and kind of the culture you're holding dear?
I do, but I can't talk about it. And because you're also kind of on this side of things with
So there is things that you have in the works that continue to make you look at the thing that you've dedicated your life to in new ways.
Yes, and then maybe to kind of go back to what I was not wanting to reveal, because of the movie, because of the paintings that I've done, it has opened doors with actual museums and train companies that are interested in this. They want to disassociate with graffiti being painted on their freight cars, but I think some people in that realm understand there is a value to it, or there is something, you know, cultural value, or even though it's illegal and it's not, again, it's hard to not like, there's some amazing things that I would love to talk about, and hopefully they will still happen. It's a matter of, you know, time and there's a lot of red tape, but yeah, it's interesting to see where it's progressed to and what possibilities are really kind of opening up in at least for me in like the freight train graffiti art, you know, realm of things.
What's like your favorite train yard in North America?
I don't know about train yard. I have one of my favorite train spots, which we had in the documentary, which is the bench in Atlanta. And for listeners, if they don't understand what the bench is, the terminology comes from the bench in New York City, where graffiti writers would watch subways go by with graffiti, and everybody would meet up and trade black books and whatever. And so that terminology has rolled over into freight train graffiti watching or benching. And the specific spot in Atlanta has multiple lines that come in from different companies. So there's trains constantly just coming through 24/7. You're not sitting there waiting an hour for a train to come by. And because of the different companies, there's so many different smaller short lines on these, like bigger, you know, CSX and Norfolk Southern are pulling all these cars through this area. So you're just seeing graffiti nonstop, and it's up on a hill. It's a perfect spot to take photos. people are there all the time, just benching, so it's a whole kind of like meeting spot essentially. And it's a special place.
Is there a particular freight train graffiti artist or group of artists that have you excited right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one. Yeah. I mean, all of my, friends, actually, I think the ones I'm more excited about are the ones that I don't know anything about. Like if I see some graffiti going by on a train and I'm like, that's a cool style. I have no idea who this person is and I can't tell where they're from. That is intriguing to me. A lot of friends and stuff, I mean, we've saturated the system with a lot of our stuff. It's always fun to see like somebody pop up, or some of the stuff that I love to see is stuff that's been like, who knows where it's been for the last 30 years and now it's showing up. Like I've had some graffiti recently that I painted in Baltimore that's barely hanging on that somebody benched recently. And it's like that has survived, one just from the buff, from weather, or from other people painting, on trains now. Like when we would paint these small little pieces. Now people paint like, and then, we could have 5 people on a boxcar. Now it's like 2 people on a boxcar, and you're painting so huge. So all of this stuff is getting covered up. So it's kind of winning the lottery if your, graffiti is showing up, from 20 or 30 years later. Like, I mean, that was the whole reason to go out there and paint them, in the first place, is to like have that longevity, and hopefully it travels around and, people see it. But some of that, you're like, you never know where it ends up. And it's always like your worst graffiti is the one that like shows up all the time and people are always taking photos of it. Yeah.
Of course. It's like always like when a band says like the song they don't like the most is the one that's the most popular. It's how it always happens.
Exactly.
That was going to be one of my questions is like, when is like, what was a piece that's kind of like, that's still running? And so you said it's like almost 30 years old, because we have like quite an international audience. What is, before we kind of head out, but what is like the difference between North American and maybe European freight train graffiti that is something that perhaps you could pinpoint?
Well, I think it's, for North American graffiti, like we have a much larger rail network than, other countries that didn't need like a huge rail network to ship stuff around. We definitely needed it. We needed it to build the country essentially, from moving east to west. And also I think, as we, talked about earlier, it's just such a, I want to say like a American folklore, like art form to the American, freight train system versus, in Europe. And I don't think there's kind of that romanticism, that's really tied to freight trains, in other countries like that. Their freight system, I think, is more intermodal based, or has seemed to be more intermodal based before here in the States. A lot of their cars are kind of like, these weird tarp covered cars. They're not like a flat box or whatever. They don't have the colorful logos, the hundreds of different short lines and all of that. They're kind of just bland. And then, of course, there's just such a better transit system in Europe. So everybody's focused on that. Like, why would you paint these rusty, things that aren't really doing much? Whereas you could paint like this amazing interrail system that people are getting on or traveling. Like that's, still the pinnacle, I would say, in graffiti, at least for me as graffiti writers. Transit is always going to, be the hierarchy of like where it kind of started from all the way down. But at least, with freight train graffiti, it's still trains, it's still traveling. It's not just like painting a wall or something like that. So, but I feel like there's definitely more in Europe and other places in the world. People are now focused on freight trains. They kind of understand, it's another aspect to paint on, as you're just doing everything from walls to whatever, it's kind of just another, feather in your hat, I guess.
Roger always laughs at me. And I think both Kim Stevens and I, when we were doing stuff with Beyond the Streets, would always say like, there's a romanticism, obviously, to the freight train. There's a romanticism to the train lines. There's a romanticism of the American dream and trains. But so for you, what is like a piece of literature or a film, besides the wonderful freight train graffiti book that you're part of and the documentary you're part of? Like, what is like a piece of literature or art that is to you about the train system that you just love? And you can say Boxcar Children if you want. I mean, everyone loved those books as kids.
Right. I don't know. I think I always, it's not going to be anything with freight train graffiti, but it's Style Wars is always what I come back to, just because and it's kind of what we were trying to emulate a little bit originally with the Rolling Like Thunder documentary, kind of following these characters, their obsession. You know, there's the villains, there's the heroes, there's the people that are, you know, the civilian side of it. Yeah, I have to come back on that literary one. What would be my conjunction junction?
Tim, I could talk to you for just like 5 hours. Like this could be like literally, this could be just a live chat forever. But I think in like conclusion, obviously the work is fantastic. I mean, I got to see up close and personal with especially with the work in London and the gallery show this year. Are you like, let's just end it on, what are you working on today?
What am I working on right now is I am replacing a piece for the Palms Casino Hotel in Las Vegas. They purchased a G-scale train, which they had in one of their suites, and somebody made off with it. So they want to have, that's what I'm working on today.
Why would they have a G-scale train in a hotel room? That seems like it's going to get nicked. How long was it in there before it got nicked?
Good question. I must have been, they just contacted me like right when I was starting to work on the show here for Beyond the Streets. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they have a collection of like, you know, a lot of street art and, you know, graffiti writers. So, but yeah, I guess they didn't have it locked down. So yeah, it rolled out. So now they're begging for a replacement. So now I've got to, which is always a pain because now I've got to try to make it look exactly like the original.
Well, whoever stole your G-scale train from the Palms in Las Vegas, like I mean, I guess it makes sense, but also come on now.
Yeah. If now it's not worth anything, this is now the better one.
Okay.
It's new and improved.
Oh,
so,
see,
yeah,
here you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, right.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for your. Oh yeah, you got something? You got something else?
I'm heading into Pittsburgh. Roger's going as well for the 30th anniversary of the NSF crew, which is also featured in Rolling Like Thunder. And we're doing, every year, usually as most bigger graffiti crews and freight train graffiti crews get together and have a barbecue or whatever, but we're also doing a roast. I think this will probably be the first graffiti roast happening for our leader, Nexky, who is turning 50. He was also in the movie. So there's going to be a roast and this graffiti meeting in Pittsburgh. Like
a proper roast? Like the whole, like people up on stage?
Like a proper...
Oh my God.
Yes. And it's all graffiti comedians that will be, I mean, not real comedians, but graffiti writers I think that are comedians, yes, that will be at this. People are coming in from all over the country. It should be pretty interesting.
I think actually this is a good way to end because I want to say this. Graffiti writers don't necessarily have the best sense of humor, but I'm hoping for the best for you and this experience.
Yeah, there's either going to be tears and a fight, but who knows.
That was Tim Conlon in conversation with Evan Pricco. Thanks, as always, to everybody for locking in to Radio Juxtapoz. If you did enjoy that, please subscribe to the channel. Before we part ways for today, I'd just like to take a moment of appreciation for Mr. Evan Pricco, who is clearly letting the British dialect rub off on him, and I absolutely love it. Take care of yourselves and each other.
How long was it in there before it got nicked?